Hello and welcome. Coming up tonight, can the Tories stop the onward march of reform? I'll ask their leader, Kemi Badenoch. Why did Keir Starmer need a court to tell him who's a woman? Labour's chair, Ellie Reeves, will explain. The economy is slowing and business costs are rising. How bad is it? Wetherspoons boss Tim Martin will tell me. Anushka and Screeny will show us how to interpret next week's local elections.
Yes, I've got all the predictions and there are some big winners and big losers.
And in the noisiest world any of us have known, we'll find the signal with the Greens leader Carla and the former Tory chair Baroness Warsi. Watcher. James Carville, the political consultant, joked that he'd like to be reincarnated as the bond market because even American presidents have to kowtow to the money men who lend to governments. Normally, it's left-wingers like our regular guest John McDonnell who fear punishment by investors. But recently, it was Liz Truss on the right who learned to her and our cost that those who control and deploy our savings won't tolerate any government that appears to be borrowing more than is affordable. Donald Trump, of course, thinks no laws of state, nature or economics apply to him until the last 24 hours, because after weeks of market turmoil caused by his tariffs and his attempt to bully the American central bank, the Federal Reserve, to cut interest rates, he has capitulated. He says the chair of the Fed, Jerome Powell, won't be sacked for disobeying him after all, and he'll negotiate with China to agree tariffs much lower than the economy-destroying 145% that Trump was imposing. Trump is the emperor with no clothes, called out not by the boy in the crowd, but by investors who sold the dollar, sold US government debt and pushed up American interest rates. Thank goodness for them, you might say, except that Russia's Putin is exploiting Trump's humiliation to try and win his support for a brutally coerced settlement with Kyiv that would see Putin take permanent control of illegally gained swathes of Ukraine. Putin calculates that Trump wants to hide his economic failure by claiming to have brought peace to Ukraine, even if that peace is disreputable. Make no mistake, the shysters are in charge, which makes the death of a leader with true moral courage, Pope Francis, all the more tragic and poignant. Anushka.
Thank you, Robert. Tonight, Donald Trump has hit out at Ukrainian President Zelensky, accusing him of making inflammatory statements, saying he has no cards to play. And look, all of this is affecting US attitudes towards Russia. Back in March 2022, a majority of Americans saw Russia as an enemy in red, according to Pew Research, then competitor in yellow, and hardly anyone said partner in green. But look how that has really tightened up. And if we just look at Republican supporters, it has actually changed completely. Competitor is now above enemy, while 1 in 8 of Republicans in the US see Russia as a partner. Meanwhile, attitudes have changed towards the US here. This is extraordinary from Opinion, asking people, do you see the US as an ally or a threat? It has shifted from a massive lead for ally, almost no one saying they see the US as a threat, to pretty much neck and neck, just 1 percentage point in it. Over a third of people in the UK now see the US as a threat. But look, that suspicion isn't doing any harm to the man who has been closest to Mr. Trump, Nigel Farage. Ahead of next week's elections, we have a sneak preview of some predictions from local elections guru Lord Robert Hayward, and he thinks Farage's Reform UK could be in for a bumper night. Lord Hayward has looked at a variety of factors, including several polls, but also campaign factors, and predicts an absolutely terrible night for Conservatives. He thinks they will lose between 475 and 525 of their 900 seats that they are defending. But who gains? Not Labour. This is a pretty grim prediction for them too. Virtually no change. Yes, they are in government. Often elections are used to kick governments, but the last time these seats were up, the Tories did really well. So that would suggest no progress for Labour since then. Instead, Reform up 400 to 450 and a big boost for Lib Dems and Greens as well. Robert says it will be a nation of two halves, the South and the West dominated by the Tories v Lib Dems and the North and the East Reform battling Labour.
Absolutely fascinating, Anushka. Thanks very much. I want to talk about both the issues that Anushka has raised, but I'm just going to start with that startling rise in the unpopularity of America among British people, that neck and neck British people now see America as a threat, as many people see it as a threat as see it as an ally. Just out of interest, I ask both of you, are those people who see America as a threat right?
Yeah, I think they've got eyes and ears. They can see what's happening. I'm not at all surprised by that change. They've seen horrendous comments and simple unreliableness from President Trump. And yeah, I've got constituents contacting me, asking me to speak to the government, as I have been, to say, please, now is a time to reconsider who our allies are and look at Europe, where generally we share more of their values. European countries aren't perfect, of course, but I think this is really a time for the UK government to consider carefully who its allies are now.
I mean, Keir Starmer, Sayeeda, is taking the view that our links with America have been going on for so long and are so deep that he refuses to characterise Trump as a threat. Is he right?
I think he's right to really see the relationship with the United States beyond the current president, and this president will come and this president will go, and that relationship has to endure. But I think there have been some key moments in this relationship with Trump which I think is affecting British public opinion. First of all, I think the discussions about, well, what has Britain ever done in terms of the war effort? I think that hit hard and that hit deep, certainly at a time when there have been so many commemorations for what happened during the First World War and the Second World War. I think, secondly, sentimental support for Ukraine over Russia is very strong in the United Kingdom, and any sense that the Ukrainians will be sold out by this Trump presidency, I think, again, has hit hard. I think, thirdly, the way in which he has treated trade tariffs, and the United Kingdom public have really seen him as being bullying towards the United Kingdom and other leaders. And then generally, I think the people in the UK don't like this kind of brash reality TV, theatrical performance from politicians. They want us to be steady and boring and sensible and all of those things. And that's not what they see in the United States right now. I think the comments around NATO, again, were important. You know, within the UK, NATO is seen as an important institution and an important aspect of where the United Kingdom makes a contribution. And again, that's been criticised. So I think it goes to quite fundamental things that have hit home with the UK public, thinking, can we trust this man?
I would add human rights and equal rights to that as well. The withdrawing of funding for diversity schemes, even for any academic research that mentions the word gender, the literal rounding up of people off the streets, including people with no criminal record, being deported to a overseas prison. I mean, people are watching agog at what on earth is happening in the United States and thinking we need to be as far away from that as possible.
And the overnight shutting down of US aid.
I mean, it's astonishing the way they've taken vital support for really vulnerable people in very poor countries. It has been shocking. Now, we'll talk about the local elections in a minute or two, probably after this interview that I did a little bit earlier with the Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch. Now, you're not going to believe this, but this is her Peston show debut. About time, too, you might say. Now, I began by asking why her government hadn't legislated to end the supposed ambiguity about the definition of a woman, why everyone had to wait for the Supreme Court to decide, despite the fact they'd been in power, that's her and her colleagues, for years.
Oh, I never thought that it was ambiguous, and this was the point that For Women Scotland, Sex Matters and all those other groups were making. There were other people who were disputing that, groups like Stonewall, and I did everything I could to provide clarity. But when we saw that the lower courts were ruling in a different way. We actually started the work to clarify that the Equality Act was referring to biological sex. The snap election came in the middle of that. That's why it ended up in the manifesto. But across the board, I made sure that wherever we could, we were stopping self-ID, making it clear that puberty blockers were not suitable for gender-questioning children, and so much more to bring a lot more common sense into this space.
Thousands of individuals, though, did believe that if they got a gender recognition certificate, and that wasn't an easy process, they had to have a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, they believed they could use, if they were trans women, women's spaces. They now feel abandoned and they're confused. They don't know the spaces they can use. Do you feel sympathy for them?
Of course I do. And I'm very angry at many of those people who created that confusion. But the law is the law. It's why I'm pleased that the Supreme Court clarified it. And we need to make sure that we have provision for those people. That's one of the things that I did when I was Equalities Minister. I remember when I put out regulations on toilets and how to make sure we had provision for transgender people. And lots of people on the left were mocking me, calling me somebody who was obsessed about loos. But this is the kind of work that needs to be done to make sure that we look after those people.
And just to be clear on one very specific aspect, is your view that, for example, in a hospital, there just has to be specific space for trans people?
So this is one of the questions that gets asked quite frequently. And we have to remember that the number of transgender people is really, really small. This is not something that requires, whole new hospitals to be built.
No, I wasn't suggesting that, but nonetheless, these are vulnerable people,
yes,
and they want to know how they're going to be treated.
Hospitals can make provision, but the law is very clear. The Supreme Court has stated that people need to be where their biological sex is, where there are single-sex spaces. If a company or an organisation is not providing single-sex spaces, that's a different thing. There are some areas where that needs to happen, like in schools, for instance, or in hospitals with wards. And we should do everything we can to accommodate those people. But we cannot change the entire system for a very small minority. Women, in particular, need privacy and dignity. We've had lots of scenarios where vulnerable, disabled women were changed by biological males. They were uncomfortable with it, felt they couldn't speak out because they thought the law wasn't on their side. That's why I welcome this Supreme Court judgment.
And just sort of one thing which I wasn't quite clear about what you just said, quite a lot of companies, I've talked to the bosses of various companies about how they are, for example, going to change their loo provision. And they're basically saying, well, we're just going to make them all non-gender specific. But I think you're saying that's not the way to go.
No, that's not the way to go. And making loos non-gender specific is fine if they're all, individual, private, unisex loos like you find with a disabled loo. But you should not be in a situation where women who need privacy are unable to have that because companies are doing something different. We never had this question before. This is a new thing. I've put out regulations. Many companies have been confused because people have been advising them badly. I would urge them to look at the guidance and regulations which I put out a couple of years ago. Let's bring some common sense back to this debate.
Now, there's lots I need to talk to you about tonight. One of the things we want to look at is net zero and energy policy, and Anushka's just going to share some data with you.
Yeah, that's right. The Conservatives, under your leadership, say they will slow the route to net zero. So I just want to focus on that for a minute, starting with steel. Some say net zero is driving high energy prices in the sector. Is that right? This suggests not really. This chart from UK Steel shows prices in France, in Germany, and over here in the UK. The cost of net zero policies does feature, that's the grey bit at the top, but actually there are exemptions in this country for heavy industry, so that is quite small in the UK. It is actually bigger in France and much bigger in Germany, and yet both have lower bills overall than we do. Our problem is way more this pink bit. Wholesale costs, basically the price that suppliers pay for electricity. And the same is true for individuals. This chart from Simon Evans at Carbon Brief looks at household electricity bills over time. Again, there is a cost associated with net zero, the levies down here in green. But again, wholesale electricity prices, again in pink, are much, much bigger. And actually, I think I can show you that it is those that have driven up prices recently, while levies over here have remained flat. So what determines that wholesale price? I can show you In the UK, it is the global gas price. The electricity price on here in blue tracks almost perfectly with gas prices in red, which is bad news for our bills when you have a crisis like a war in Ukraine. One study claimed that gas prices determine our electricity price 98% of the time, compared to 24% in Germany and 7% in France. Why are they protected? Because we are more reliant on gas, this blue bit here, than in Germany, and way more than in France, where actually nuclear is a much bigger part of our mix. And I guess one question then is, if you want to get bills down, isn't there an argument you should be moving faster towards renewables and away from fossil fuels?
So the answer to that is yes and no. A really important thing to ask is, why is it that we're so reliant on gas? And it's because we moved away from coal production. That is also partly a net zero input in there. So that's still having net zero as a reason for that. It doesn't mean that we should go back to coal. But if we're moving our steel production to China, where they're opening a coal-fired plant every other week, that doesn't make sense. So we're not really reducing net zero. We might be doing so in this country, but we're still increasing emissions all around the world. So that's one thing. The second thing is about the mix between renewables and gas and the way that the grid can handle it. We are actually sometimes forced to switch off things because the grid cannot handle it. That has a cost. We end up having a second system of distribution that adds cost to bills. That's where that wholesale electricity price is coming from. But the point I've been making about net zero is not just about electricity prices or gas prices or household bills overall. What I'm saying is that the plans that we have for net zero by 2050 are not working, they're not possible.
But hang on a second. I mean, I spoke to Jonathan Brearley, who your government appointed as energy regulator, head of Ofgem. He is absolutely clear that the reason why our energy prices are higher for individuals and businesses is simply because the marginal cost of gas drives that price. And he is absolutely clear. The faster we move to nuclear and other renewables, the faster we will get the energy price down. So you must approve of that. We've got to go for hell for leather to reduce reliance on gas.
Yes, let's do that. But that's not a net zero by 2050 plan. That's a let's get nuclear in place plan. That's a let's make sure that we have a proper mix of electricity production. We cannot bankrupt our country by pursuing a plan that doesn't work. And
we can come back to this another time, but most people wouldn't say, they just don't understand why you're obsessed with net zero by 2050. What they're interested in is get power down, and if renewables do that, let's just do it.
Yes, but renewables aren't doing that. At the moment...
But they are.
No, they're not. I completely disagree with that. And what we are actually seeing is a reliance on countries like China. We cannot build our wind turbines, our solar panels without China. We've been using slave labour. I think that's absolutely disgusting. Conservatives voted against that. Labour put that through. I think they're now U-turning. Yeah. The plan doesn't make sense. We shouldn't have to rely on child labour or on slave labour to reach...
Everybody watching will completely agree with you about it.
Yes, that's right.
And I do want to move on. There's so much to talk to you about.
But the point I'm making is that that plan is not working. I didn't hire Jonathan Brearley. The Conservative Party is under new leadership. We need to do things differently. And that's one of the things that we're changing. OK, I do need to talk to you about that more, but it's going to have to be another time, annoyingly. Now, however, I do need to move on to the recording of what your Justice Secretary told students. He said to them that he felt there had to be some kind of coalition with Reform before the general election. Now, I know he's saying that is just somehow or other he's got to get Reform voters. But I listened to it. It sounds to me as though he wants a pact. Well, I've been very clear that there will be no pact. Reform, Nigel Farage has said that their aim is to destroy the Conservative Party. My job and Robert's job is to make sure that the Conservative Party, which has been around for hundreds of years, continues to be around. But have you had a chance to talk to him since he made those remarks? Yes, I saw him. I saw him earlier today, and I think those remarks are being overblown. He's made a point that I do agree with. Mm-hmm. We lost a lot of votes to Reform. We had a very, very heavy defeat last year. We're going to have very challenging local election results next year. They're going to be absolutely, difficult compared to where we were 4 years ago. We have to get the votes back of people we lost. And at that last election, people voted particularly for Reform, but other parties because they didn't want Conservatives. That means making sure we have a centre-right offer that is compelling. And that is going to need us getting those voters back. There's nothing controversial in that.
I mean, Tory peer Rob Hayward, respected pollster, I'm sure you know him, says these local elections won't just be bad, they'll be a disaster for your party. You are currently in third place at the polls. At what point do you start to think, well, maybe it's about me?
Well, given that the last oppositions were there for 14 years, 13 years and 18 years, I think 5.5 months, I've got a little bit of time before it's about me. But what Rob is saying is very true. 4 years ago, we fought those elections when we were polling on a high, well above average. Boris Johnson was Prime Minister. It was a vaccine bounce. We won 2/3 of the seats we stood in. That's unprecedented. No party's ever done that. So even if we went back to average, we'd lose seats, let alone where we are polling now.
Your mission is to destroy reform. Most people would say that Rob Jenrick is campaigning for himself, not the Tory party. Do you genuinely still have confidence in him?
My mission is to make sure that the Conservative Party gets back into government by offering a compelling centre-right offer. I have a great team. Rob is somebody who does a lot of work selling the Conservative message.
And himself.
He has done what I asked him to do. I said, go after Labour, go on sentencing. That was the first thing I said. Lots of people complained that I was making him Shadow Justice Secretary. Now they're saying he's doing a good job. That is a reflection of my judgment, and that's what I want to see across the Shadow Cabinet.
Kemi Badenoch, really good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you, Robert.
Carla, if I could just start with you on the trans ruling by the Supreme Court. You'll have heard Keir Starmer in the House of Commons today saying that it's his priority to protect the rights of trans people. You'll have heard what Kemi Badenoch has just said. Do you trust the Prime Minister when he says that's what he's going to do?
I am a fair bit concerned about the consequences of the Supreme Court ruling, because while it sought to clarify some things, my concern is that it has created more uncertainty elsewhere. And I know there are a lot of trans, non-binary and intersex people who are feeling very worried about what it could mean and are looking at a lot of uncertainty for how they can simply live out their lives, carry out their lives in peace. So I'm really anxiously waiting for the government, for the EHRC to clarify what this ruling means, and I won't hesitate to push for further legislation if it seems like it's needed.
I mean, Sayeeda, do you understand why some trans people feel that they're sort of being marginalised now in society?
I think where I agree with Kemi is when she says that you can't change the whole system for a small minority. But the bit that Kemi didn't then say is, but that you have to have a system to service that small minority. And that's the bit of it that I want to kind of go back to, that I think it's completely right, and I agree with the Supreme Court ruling, that single-sex spaces are protected. And remember, this is a ruling on a very specific part of the Equality Act and its interpretation of what it means to be a woman. But the Equality Act also protects discrimination against those people who have had gender reassignment. And therefore, what we can't say is this is an either or. What we have to say is, well, now that we have this ruling, how does the public sector and the private sector respond to? What does the guidance look like to ensure that the trans community are not discriminated against, that we don't actually, it doesn't lead to a rise in prejudice, and that there is appropriate service provision. And that's why I think actually that was probably one of Kemi's better interviews, where she didn't turn this into a culture war, but actually made it about the provision of services to different communities and different needs.
We're almost out of time before we have to go to a break, but can I just ask you very briefly, Sayeeda, I mean, to be clear, Kemi did say that, you know, she wants to see trans people protected, but many would say that quite a lot of her time in charge has been about, in a sense, exploiting divisions between people rather than bringing people together. It's very different from the approach that David Cameron took when he led the Tories out of opposition. Do you think you can win by exploiting division, or in the end do you have to build coalitions across communities?
I think it is a very different kind of Conservative Party, and parts of it I definitely don't recognise from the time of my time in David Cameron's cabinet. I think, unfortunately, Robert, Brexit proved that you can win by exploiting divisions, and that's why it has set a broader trend in our politics, as we've seen in the United States, where divisive politics does play some dividends. But for me, both for the sake of the country and for the long-term future of the Conservative Party, we've got to find a way back from that. And that's why I said that was probably one of Kemi's better interviews. It wasn't as divisive. It wasn't as populist, and it was much more sensible. And I genuinely hope that when she says she's talking about building a Conservative Party which is centre-right, she means it and she starts to show that.
Carla, would you forgive me, I'm going to come back to you in a minute or two, but we've just sadly got to go to a break. After it, we've got the founder of Wetherspoons, Tim Martin, and another great treat, we've got the chairman of the Labour Party, Ellie Reeves. You can't miss him.
Years ago.
Hello, we're talking about baby pictures. I think we're talking about it because Prince Louis has just turned 7 and we got pictures of him as a 7-year-old. So what better excuse than to look at young pictures? And it is Guess the Politician. We're going to have to whiz through them because we've got quite a few here. I didn't realise that was who that was. So do you know who this is?
Is that Liz Truss?
Yeah.
She hasn't changed. Of course it's Liz Truss.
She looks quite different. That was when she was a Lib Dem. Who's this?
Oh,
Who are those little twins? This picture looks so different than other ones I've seen.
No idea.
is that Michael?
No. Michael Gove?
Yeah.
No. Similar politics?
No idea.
Wes Streeting. You know who this is?
Yes.
Rachel Reeves?
Yeah, Rachel Reeves.
Is that Wes?
What, consistent
Wow.
hair?
Consistent hair, that is true.
Oh, my God.
I literally want to see some of these. Who is this?
Oh dear, I'm not very good at this.
You know who that is?
Do I?
You know who this is?
The one in the middle?
Yeah? No? OK, this is Angela Rayner.
Oh.
This person led the Conservative Party.
I was going to tell you. It's just Theresa.
Teresa.
Theresa.
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness! I've never seen this one before.
That's fantastic.
I recognise it, but I can't
Once
remember
you
who it
see it, you see it.
I see those eyes and I
Yeah,
just can't work it out.
something's
He's going to do very well next week. A bit like you, but in a different political way.
That's Farage, isn't
That
it?
is Nigel Farage.
Wow.
Blimey.
Amazing
Look
picture.
at his eyes. All right, I think this one's obvious.
Yeah, it is.
And this one. And this one. Come
Is that
on.
Rishi at the far
That
end?
must-
That is
That's
Rishi.
Rishi in the front.
Sunak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bet. On the left.
That is Yvette.
Oh, yeah.
Correct, Yvette Cooper. This is somebody who's been in the news, who would like to be a
Robert.
leader.
Yeah, you
Robert
can see
Dedrick.
it from his
Wow,
mouth.
that's
Yeah.
amazing.
He looks exactly the same. All right,
wow.
here we go, here we go, here we go.
I
Who
think
is
that's
this?
Shabana on the left.
That is Shabana Mahmood. Who is this? Again, when you see it, you see it.
Oh. Who is that?
One of your heroes, friends, colleagues,
Heroes.
another leader of a Conservative Party.
David.
We've got one on every page. David
Oh,
Cameron.
yes.
Oh, yeah, I see it now.
Yeah, you see it. And
And Ed Miliband, you can
Ed
see that from the other
Miliband.
side of the
Here we go.
field, yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
God.
Boris. Can't go wrong, can you, there?
is that real?
I'm going to be really insulting now, but that middle one looks a bit like Robert Peston.
It is Robert Peston.
Look at it. How old are you there, Robert? Before they had colour.
I am 10, or I think I'm 10.
You've got the same frown.
And final one.
Ooh.
Another political leader.
Yeah.
Politically closer to you, maybe, Carla?
Is that, the Liberal
Kennedy or
Democrat? Yeah, from...
No.
Oh,
Jeremy
I-
Corbyn.
Oh,
There we go.
I would have said that
Wow.
was Kennedy.
Yeah.
Welcome back. Now, it must be local elections time because earlier I was joined by Labour's chair, Ellie Reeves. I pointed out to her that for years, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party were clear that trans women are women. So why on earth would the ruling of a court, even the Supreme Court, change his and all of their minds?
Well, I think that the Supreme Court's judgment has provided really helpful clarity in relation to this issue, and the Prime Minister has been really clear in his comments yesterday and in Prime Minister's questions today. I think the important thing is that following that judgment, that we move forward, that we take the heat out of the debate, and that's a really important thing to do.
I mean, there's no probably more important place for people to feel that they've got the dignity and respect they need than a hospital. It's one of the reasons why Keir Starmer said today, as Bridget Phillipson said yesterday, that you are going to phase out mixed-sex wards. But if a trans person falls ill today and it's no longer appropriate for them to go into a single-sex ward, where are they going to go?
Well, the Equality and Human Rights Commission will issue guidance, and rightly so, and we await that guidance. But, it is right that there are single-sex wards, and actually for far too long, under the previous government, people weren't being treated in single-sex wards and were waiting far too long for a hospital bed. I'm really proud, actually, that this Labour government has got waiting lists down 6 months in a row. But in relation to the guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, hopefully that will come shortly following that important Supreme Court judgment.
The Supreme Court judgment really did say no more than your colleague, or your former colleague, Rosie Duffield, was constantly saying, and she said she felt marginalised within the Labour Party. Do you think Keir Starmer should apologise to Rosie Duffield?
Well, Rosie stood on the same manifesto as me and Keir at the general election, which talked about the protection of single-sex spaces and the importance of that. We stood on that manifesto, and the Supreme Court judgment has given useful and helpful clarity in relation to it now, and now we await that guidance.
I mean, everybody will notice that you haven't answered the question about whether she deserves an apology. I mean, are you doubting her sincerity when she said that she felt as though she was being cast out of the Labour Party?
Well, I'm sorry that she feels like that. She did stand on the same manifesto as Keir, as myself and others in the Labour Party, which did have that protection for single-sex spaces in it. And I'm really proud that the Labour Party is the party that introduced the Equality Act with those provisions in it.
I mean, it does sound as though you're saying she doesn't deserve an apology. If we could move on, we saw some borrowing figures today that were way over the official forecasts. Really quite shocking. And the biggest cause of that is not tax. Tax revenues were above forecast. What's way higher than people, or your government, the Treasury, expected, is spending. Why can't the Chancellor control spending?
Well, look, I think we are in a very different world to when we came to government back in July. There's been lots of challenges in the world since then, lots of changes to the global economy. We've been clear in our fiscal rules and restoring stability to the economy after 14 years of chaos under the Conservatives. I don't think people have forgotten that mini budget that crashed the economy, that sent interest rates spiralling. And I think providing that economic stability is incredibly important.
I mean, your sister, indeed, you've just reinforced it now, and indeed Keir Starmer have said that honouring the fiscal rules, not breaking them, is the #1 priority of this government. That does mean that taxes may well have to go up in the autumn.
Well, look, there's always speculation. We had this ahead of the spring statement. We're getting on with growing the economy and putting money back into people's pockets.
Downing Street told me that Keir Starmer is the first British Prime Minister to hold a St George's Day party in Downing Street. Some would say, in so much that you're being more Nigel Farage than Nigel Farage. Now, Kemi Badenoch has rejected a coalition with Reform, but maybe Labour should talk about working with Reform.
Well, I don't think that holding celebrations for St George's Day means that you're about to jump into an electoral pact with Reform. And look at what Robert Jenrick has said around Reform and Tories joining forces for the next election. I think Kemi Badenoch needs to come clean about, whether there are going to be these backroom deals. And actually, voters go to the polls next week for local elections. I think people need to know if they're voting Conservative, do they get Reform? If they're voting Reform, do they get Conservatives? Because according to the Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Jenrick, it sounds like they are going to be one and the same.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
So there's quite a lot I want to talk to you about, but I would quite like, Carla, just to go back to one aspect of the conversation that I had with Kemi Badenoch earlier on in the programme. I have to say, I don't fully understand. I said to her, I don't fully understand her position on net zero, because she does agree that actually, energy costs would come down if we move faster away from gas. I suppose one question, though, which has been bothering me for a bit is, if you look at, for example, why costs of power in a place like Spain are way lower than they are here, it's because the transition costs to going green go through the general tax system. They're not loaded on customers' bills. Do you think that's a better way? Do you think this government should be a bit braver and simply pay for the transition through taxation and, frankly, make British industry more competitive by lowering the cost of power?
Yes, I do think that there's a lot that the government could do. One of those things is where those so-called policy costs go, because at the moment they are on electricity bills, which disincentivises people switching from a gas boiler to a heat pump, for example, which uses, obviously, electricity. You could argue for putting that onto gas bills, but then that would have a perverse incentive of penalising often the very poorest households who are likely to be the last to switch. Although, again, there's a lot the government could be doing to help those on the lowest incomes to switch first, and that's the kind of thing that I and the Greens have been pushing on. There's another quite nerdy thing. Forgive me, I am an engineer that used to work in the renewable sector, and I reckon the Peston audience has the appetite for a bit of nerdiness.
Badenoch was an engineer. We were just discussing this.
Yes, but so there's also this trouble with coupling. So as we discussed a bit earlier, the electricity price in this country is set by the marginal price of gas, which means that even if gas is only providing 2% of our electricity, if it's the last 2%, that sets the price of the whole lot. That's stupid. That's a policy. That's a thing about how the market is designed. It could be designed differently. The previous government did consider changing that, ruled it out. I would like to see this government look again, because that could take a few £100 off household energy bills almost overnight.
It does seem like a crazy system, as you say. Sayeeda, we've got tons more time in a minute or two, so I'm going to come back to you then, but I've just got to go to Anushka.
Thank you. We had a big briefing from the International Monetary Fund yesterday, and I wanted to pick out one of their charts. They called this the Trade Policy Uncertainty Index, basically measured using media references to uncertainty across the world. And you can see that it went off the charts, basically vertical with Donald Trump's tariffs. So these are being seen as very uncertain times, which can be bad for business. And you know what else is bad for business? Borrowing costs. And more bad news there today, as Robert mentioned in the last interview. This looks at the Office for Budget Responsibility's forecasts for borrowing costs in the UK. The first bar, the yellow bar, is what they predicted in March 2024. The green, March 2025. So you can see that they upgraded their forecasts for each year for 23-24, 24-25 and 25-26. But as we've had two of those years, we also have the actual numbers in maroon. So the OBR were actually spot on last year. But look at this. Even worse than their pretty worrying predictions. If that trend continues, given the government's fiscal rules, tax rises in the autumn could be back on the agenda, something that would be very worrying for business.
Yeah, very likely to be back on the agenda. I'm delighted to be joined by Tim Martin, founder, boss of Wetherspoons. I mean, the uncertainty is extraordinary. I don't know if you saw on CBS tonight, they're reporting that the bosses of Walmart and Target, enormous store chains in America, are saying that their shelves may be empty quite soon because they can't get the stuff out of the rest of the world because of these tariffs. Your pubs are a sort of barometer of how people feel. How anxious are people? And I mean, the economy is slowing down, but how does it feel on the ground?
I think people are a little bit more sanguine than maybe if they all watched your programme, they'd be a bit more worried. But I think they're not quite as bad as the stock market. They're less volatile than the indicators like the stock market, the bond market, and so on. But I noticed that the savings ratio in the UK, the amount that people save, is much higher than it's been for a long time. So perhaps that's an indication that actually now they are getting quite worried.
Yeah, that is normally a sign of people feeling a bit more anxious and wanting to be cautious. We've just had that increase in employers' national insurance, minimum wage going up, business rates going up. Your costs have gone up very significantly. How hard is that for your business?
I mean, it's pretty... anyone in the hospitality industry has said it's hard. I usually say to people, well, our costs are going up by 1.2 million a week. Yeah. And it's a hell of a lot. It's approximately equivalent to our after-tax profits before they went down during the pandemic. So it's a hell of a lot of money.
But you're coping?
We're coping, yes.
But do you worry that smaller chains, smaller businesses are...
Or bigger. Not everyone will cope. Our prices are low. We've got some advantages. We've got mostly freehold pubs. Our debt's not too high. I think a lot of other people haven't got all those things going for them and may struggle more. They will struggle more.
And you've just heard the analysis which shows there is a very big, certainly possibility, I would say probability, that taxes will have to go up again in the autumn if she sticks to her word that she's not going to break her fiscal rules. How anxious would you be about that?
I'd be pretty anxious. I mean, business has borne a lot of the burden, and I think the cries for help from business are not artificial, so it'll be difficult to whack them up again.
Tim, don't go away. There's tons more I need to ask you. There'll be lots more from Sayeeda and Carla as well. See you in a minute.
Hello. Welcome to the break, #Peston. So here we go. A politician walks into a pub. They all go out, they pull their pints for the cameras. But what I want to know is, you've wined and dined a few politicians, maybe? What do they really like to drink? What do you think they would order if they came into a Spoons? Do you really think he's a pint man?
I would say in the old days he would have been a light and lager guy, or a light and bitter, a light ale and a half
just
pint
light
of beer. Yeah.
What makes him light?
Well, I just don't think he looks like he likes a sherbet too much. You know, I think he's cautious, very loyal, cautious,
light man.
Yeah.
What do you think, Kemi Badenoch? Was she cautious?
I think she's a little bit more flamboyant. I'm going for a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc type of gal. That's what she seems.
Not that flamboyant.
Well, I think she is.
Turns out I'm flamboyant.
But that was Liz Truss, wasn't it? Sammy Blanc was Liz Truss.
I thought you were going to say like a pina colada or something. A New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, OK. Oh, it could be food too, not drink only.
So is it Nigel next?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nigel,
and you guys throw an
I
idea?
think, there's a very good drink, very popular in our pubs at the moment, called Jaipur, which is a craft beer, and it's quite strong. And I've seen Nigel knock a few back. Ooh. He's genuine sherbet guy, so yeah, he's on the Jaipur.
I love the sherbet guy. I actually hosted Nigel for a dinner of press gallery political journalists recently. I think it was a gin and tonic at arrival and then a very nice bottle of red.
If he comes on this show, he'll drink 2 or 3 pints before he goes on. I've seen him do it.
And still be fine?
Yeah.
Would you have a drink with Nigel Farage?
Would I have
Or
a
a
drink
meal?
with Nigel? Listen, I'll have a drink and a meal with anybody. I think it'll be great conversation. We probably won't agree on very much, but yeah.
Do you
I'm happy
reckon?
to-
Would you,
and the
Carla?
fact that he'll be the one that's drinking alcohol and I'm going to be on sparkling water, hopefully I'll still be compos mentis at the end of it.
Would you?
There are other people in the House of Commons I'd rather go for a drink.
This lady?
Put it that way.
Angela Rayner?
Oh, she would be such a laugh.
She'd be a fun night.
I mean,
out,
I would love
wouldn't
to go out for a drink with her.
What do you
or
think she'd drink?
Bite to eat.
There's definitely a Provence rosé, I think, for
A rosé?
the red hair. Yeah, definitely a Provence.
What does she?
rosé.
She actually apparently likes a venom cocktail.
Oh,
What is
well.
that, Pish? I've forgotten.
Yeah, well, she shouldn't have told people that.
Oh, she put the cocktail recipe
Vodka, whiskey, WKD blue, and orange juice.
Oh my God, that's welcome back. I'm delighted Tim Martin's here. You may have seen Kemi saying that gender-neutral loos won't be allowed. So, in the light of the Supreme Court ruling, how will you be, in a sense, both badging your loos within your pubs, and how are you going to serve, provide loos for trans people?
It's a vexed issue, and I don't know the answer. I'd never been asked it in my 45-year career until it came up as a political issue from nowhere. I suppose pubs have an advantage in they have a gender-neutral loo anyway, which is the disabled facility in modern pubs. Some of the older ones don't, and they're very difficult and expensive to install. But I'm just not sure of the answer.
How many pubs have you got?
800.
Oh my goodness, it's quite a big logistical problem for you, isn't it?
Well, we're putting in staff loos now, back of house we call it, and it's a 50 million investment. So it's, it could be 100,000 a pub or more just to put in a few staff loos.
Because this is not going to be optional. You're going to have to provide single-sex spaces and provision for trans people.
Well, we'll have to see where the legislation ends up. I don't know to what extent it's gone through Parliament yet, and people can consider it in more detail. That's what Parliament's for.
But it doesn't require legislation. There's going to be some rules issued by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and that's it. And there won't be debate about it. It'll simply be imposed.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of things need a bit more debate, and a lot of things have been subcontracted to organisations which make the rules up, and then the problems arise thereafter. So I'd like it to be debated in Parliament. I'm going to phone up Keir and tell him he's got to do it.
OK, it'll be interesting to see what he has to say about that.
I will, yeah.
But one of the things that you have said, which I think people might have been surprised to hear you say, is you won't be bullied by Trump into backing, because you are an organisation that believes in diversity and equity and essentially having as diverse a workforce as possible, and you're not going to back off that, are you?
Well, I think it'd be pretty mad to... there's lots of exhortation to follow certain lines, sometimes quite radical. So if suddenly you've been running a business for 45 years and Donald jumps up and says, this is what the rules are, it doesn't sound as if you should follow them. So we've developed our own rules. Obviously, we're living in British society, which is very diverse anyway. So we don't want to do anything to upset people. And I think agreeing with Donald is a good way to upset people from what I can see at the moment.
Well, we had some research on that earlier in the programme which proved that. But, I mean, one of the things, though, that Tim has just said, which I think is sort of worth bearing. He's got 800 pubs, and he's not 100% sure what he's going to do about his loos. And there'll be many, many employers similarly confused.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting at really earlier when I was saying that the government needs to urgently clarify how it intends to interpret this court ruling, and that really is on the government, not on the court. It's created uncertainty for business owners. It's creating uncertainty for trans, non-binary and intersex people who are wondering, well, what is it that I'm meant to do then? And imagine how unsettling it must be to not know which toilet you're meant to be going to be afraid of being confronted, being challenged by perhaps, you know, it might not even be the staff that work somewhere. It might be someone who's taken matters into their own hands to decide that someone might not be a trans person, might be a lesbian or bisexual woman like myself who doesn't look sufficiently feminine and so gets challenged for being in the women's zoos. There's all kinds of potential unintended consequences here arising from the actual lack of clarity that's been created, I think, by this ruling.
I mean, one of the things that Sayeeda said earlier, and I'm going to come back to Sayeeda in a minute on this, but she did say earlier that one of the problems with Brexit is it proved that the politics of division works, which is obviously something that is a concern to all of us now. Now, you did back Brexit, so I've got to ask you, give me at least one positive economic benefit.
What you will remember at the time, people said that it would destroy jobs, be bad for the economy. We've created 1.3 million jobs, the lowest ever unemployment in our history, and that's been the scourge of our lifetime, Robert. And half the unemployment rate of France. It's been chaos, but somehow democracy works. And we also vote for the people who
but there is also
govern the country.
But Tim, there's also a lot of, even if we've created jobs, a lot of those have been low-wage jobs. We've got a genuine poverty issue in this country, and there's an enormous amount of economic evidence that we would be considerably richer. Productivity would be higher if we were still part of the single market.
We've outgrown, since the referendum, we've outgrown Germany and France. So we've done OK. I mean, we haven't shot the lights out. We've done OK. Democracy works, Robert. You've got to remember that. And you should
I'm all in
vote
favour.
for the president.
I'm all in favour of democracy. Do you think this government, Sayeeda, ought to be a bit braver when it comes to actually negotiating a better deal with the EU?
I think we have to realign our relationship with the European Union, not just because of the economy, not just because actually the benefits of Brexit are not as clear as sometimes people want to portray, but because if we have learned anything since the Trump presidency, it is that we can't take for granted that the United States will stand alongside us at moments of crisis. And therefore, it is in our interest to re-strengthen that relationship with the European Union. And whatever we can find moments of realignment, I think we should be looking to do that.
I mean, I just wanted to point us, because we've got almost out of time, and we should really have talked more about this, but the Spectator's front page shows it's all about the fact that we've seen the death of somebody who was a genuinely good person. And, I mean, I don't know what you felt. You know, when I saw him deliver that Easter message, so frail, and then literally, you know, hours later, you heard he died. I mean, this was a man who believed in duty to an extent that so few of our leaders do now. I mean...
It's such a huge loss, Robert. I mean, I had the privilege of being at Pope Francis' inauguration. I represented the government at the time. I was the Minister for Faith at the Cabinet. And right from that moment, the way in which he has championed the cause of the poor, the vulnerable, refugees, migrants, the way in recent times, if you look at the war in the Middle East, where one of the things little known about him is that almost on a daily basis at 7 o'clock in the evening, he would ring the Christian community in Gaza.
I know, I saw the film of that. It's really moving.
Yeah, he was one of the few people who was at this very difficult time speaking truth to power. And even in his final Easter message was calling for peace and was calling for release of hostages and for aid to be let back into Gaza. He was a compassionate, kind man with a huge amount of humour and a huge loss at a time when the world is very divided and fractious. Now, look, sadly, we are out of time. Tim, amazingly good to see you, as always. Thank you very much for coming in. Thanks, Sayeeda. Thanks, Carla. That is it. Next Thursday, many of you get the chance to vote in local and mayoral elections. Still can't make up your mind who to back? Well, on the eve of poll, we'll be here to help you. Goodbye.